New Zealand claims that it has eliminated, not eradicated, coronavirus. The Prime Minister saying that one day reported just one new case today. Easing restrictions. Businesses are already partially reopening as much as they can. 400,000 people have returned to work, and schools are reopening only with limited capacity. And some parts of Australia are also beginning to reopen this week, including Queensland and Western Australia. Obviously, New South Wales is having more difficulties. That's where Sydney and the major metropolitan areas are. Sydney's Bondi Beach will reopen on Tuesday. It's only for swimming and surfing. Kevin Rudd is in Queensland's, former Australian Prime Minister and President of the Asia Society and Policy Institute, joins me now. Kevin, good to see you, sir. I hope you and your family have weathered this crisis well. Kevin, it's difficult, but besides geographical remoteness, to what do you attribute relative success of New Zealand and Australia in handling this?
Well, I think you're right, Richard. Being an island helps, either a small island or, as the New Zealanders call us, the big island. But the bottom line is there's also been a great creative dynamic between the New Zealand government and the Australian government, by which I mean this. Jacinda Ardern, quite early on, the New Zealand Prime Minister, adopted a policy an official policy of virus elimination. Now, that set in motion a series of quite radical measures in terms of radical border closures, including with Australia, as well as early lockdown. And the creative tension then across the Tasman Sea between the two was the Australian government fairly rapidly followed suit. And so as a consequence, I think both countries have benefited from those sorts of actions. But there are other factors at play in this as well, Richard.
Kevin, I want to talk about your recent article on who's really to blame in all of this. All right, you may take issue with my word of blame, but you know what I mean. In terms of the fact that this pandemic got out of the gate and the unrealistic, for example, death numbers that we see out of China, which leads to a lack of trust in the way China handled this at the beginning and have reported numbers since.
Yeah, well, obviously, there are real problems which we've still got to wrestle to the ground in terms of how all this came about in the first place. Richard, if you don't mind, I'd just like to add one or two things to my earlier answer and then come back to this one. The other thing just about Australia in particular, where I am, is that the government has benefited from, one, a high degree of bipartisanship between opposition and government, but two, critically, those in our federation, those governments responsible for actually implementing, let's call it socialisation, lockdown and school management on the ground, are the Australian state governments. And by and large, the state governments led by their premiers have put their own politics to one side and have done a pretty good job of it. But one caveat about Australia and New Zealand, will there be a, as it were, delayed Southern Hemisphere effect? We don't know that as the weather cools down in the Southern Hemisphere as we get towards May and June. On the origins of the virus, Richard, and the global blame game, look, I think the smartest thing we can all do is put the scientists in control of all of this. How did the virus first emerge in Wuhan? You know the contending theories as well as I did. Two, when did it get notified to Beijing? And three, was there a delay in getting the information through to the WHO? Right. And four, what did the WHO do with it? These are the core questions.
But you know, we hear reports that the EU has just altered, watered down a report into the origins that was going to be critical of China and the way, because they feared China's repercussions and response. China sending out a message that, except maybe to the US and to Donald Trump, anyone who chooses to take truck with them over their handling will face repercussions. This is not helpful.
No, you're absolutely right. The sort of what I describe as wolf diplomacy that we've seen from elements of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, including that ridiculous statement of the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman a month or so ago, inferring that the United States Army was somehow ultimately responsible for the origin of the virus in itself in the first place. frankly, does China no good at all.
Right.
The bottom line, China, together with the rest of the international community, would be well served in simply letting the science speak for itself, rather than any governments, one way or the other, issuing threats against each other. The science is, frankly, what lies at the heart of solving this thing as well.
Kevin Rudd joining us this afternoon or this morning for your early start for you on the Sunshine Coast. Kevin, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.